So welcome everybody, and my name is Eric, and I am with the West Coast Climate Action Network on the local government team, and we're kicking off our series of climate champion stories that we want to share with everybody. Some of the success stories that we've had from some of our local elected leaders. And so today we've got Dave Thompson and Jeremy Cardonna. I should say Councillor Dave Thompson and Councillor Jeremy Cardonna from the City of Victoria, newly elected and also serving on the Capital Regional District Board. So why don't we start with Dave, if you can give a quick introduction about the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having us on here, and thanks for doing it. Yeah, I mean, we are doing a whole bunch of things to accelerate climate action in Victoria. I think Victoria has for a few years been regarded as a climate action leader. Jeremy and I got into office here on the promise that we would be accelerating Victoria's work and also working at the regional level to try to move climate action forward further and quicker. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that?
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having us. My name is Jeremy Cardonna. Yeah, City Councillor, CRD Director. Before I was an elected official, I was teaching part-time at the University of Victoria in environmental studies, and I will probably go back to doing that part-time at some point. And I was also working as a climate policymaker for the province. So stepping into this role is in many ways a continuation of the work I've already been doing outside of civic government, although obviously there's a lot of other things we do as civic leaders that don't relate directly to climate. But that's definitely been it was a campaign focus of mine, and it's been a focus since I've been on council. And it was funny to hear you say newly minted or newly elected, because it feels like we've actually been here quite a long time already.
It's actually been 6 months. It goes by fast, doesn't it?
Goes by fast, and I think we're an eighth of the way through our mandate already. So time flies. And that's why we wanted to front load this mandate with a lot of the really important climate work. So I would say the two crowning achievements on the climate front, at least for direct climate action, have been the update to the climate leadership plan that we initiated and which we can discuss, and then also really taking a leadership role on the zero carbon step code, which has now been copied by a number of other jurisdictions around here.
Yeah, and that was that. So that brings us to, that was the focus of today's talk, was we wanted to talk about that zero carbon step code and kind of accelerating that. So I don't know who wants to take the lead on this to tell us about that initiative in particular. Like, what's the problem that you guys were trying to solve? How does this address it?
Civilizational collapse. I mean, we're not going to solve that.
It's not funny. It's true, right?
We'll hopefully help to do our little part to delay it. But my thinking was, for this initiative and for others, that if we can do things that move the needle locally and move us forward, we can hopefully encourage other municipalities across Canada and beyond to do the same. And as Jeremy alluded to, this is sort of happening now. So I'll just give a little bit of background, and then maybe Jeremy can jump into some of the technical aspects of it. Just by way of background, there's the energy step code, which just deals with energy efficiency. But the BC government has been talking for quite a while about what they called the carbon pollution standard. And the idea there was that we'll have another code that will allow municipalities to regulate directly carbon emissions from buildings. That was delayed a couple times, and so a number of municipalities on the Lower Mainland adopted a sort of a workaround where they used the energy step code to sort of further a low carbon, zero carbon requirement or set of requirements for buildings. So that I think was employed by 8 or 9 municipalities, that workaround, representing more than half the population of BC. And so between that and the fact that industry knows how to build buildings at a zero carbon level, I think that set us up pretty well to accelerate what the city was doing. And the city had worked with other cities around the region to come up with a sort of a timeline for how quickly to implement zero carbon for municipalities in this region. And we looked at that timeline from last summer, and it stretched things out to 2025. And we thought we have an opportunity to speed that up because it's doable. We know that because builders are already building that way. And because other municipalities have already required it. So, Jeremy, do you want to take over from there?
I was going to say, maybe you can touch on why that acceleration is so important. Sure. Right? When we're talking about, specifically, we're talking about new home construction, correct? Or new building construction, really. And so why is it important to accelerate that timeline? Like, we know that there's an urgency involved, but I think when it comes to new building construction, that urgency is compounded. Maybe you want to talk to that as well.
I can answer that maybe before giving some of the broader context. Is that if and when we build buildings that run on high carbon systems, we're locking those buildings into those high carbon systems for potentially multiple decades. And at some point, we're just kind of removing those systems. And so there is an urgency because we want to avoid creating more problems and more costs for all of us down the line. That's the short answer. I mean, maybe a second level answer would be that we have these enabling authorities now. And so there's no reason to delay because the market's ready for it. I mean, in a lot of ways, decarbonization of new buildings is a lot simpler than increasing energy efficiency because fuel switching has become more or less cost effective and doable now, shifting to heat pumps, et cetera. Whereas dealing with increased energy efficiency is actually a much more complex beast if we think about the BC Energy Code, because you have to contemplate increasing your R value and your U value and HVAC systems and your electrical systems and your power systems and all of that, your air tightness. There's a whole lot of different metrics that are at play in your TUI and your TEDI and all these other technical terms that come out of BC Energy Step Code. So in a lot of ways, we figured fuel switching or decarbonization of new construction, there's not really a rationale to wait. You might as well just rip the Band-Aid off and do it because all the buildings that are built between now and when it would have phased in. And by the way, the city of Victoria already had a pretty expedited timeline to do this. There weren't that many other jurisdictions that had committed to 2025, but we like being leaders in this space. So we said, let's start it this year. So
because the mandate from the provincial government is to reach this level by, what was it, 2030?
Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly. And the Energy Step Code tops out at 2032.
Yeah.
So we're way out in front here. But I guess maybe just to add a little bit more context to what Dave was saying is that both the BC Energy Step Code and the Zero Carbon Step Code are both creatures of the BC Building Code. And the BC Building Code over time has become this vehicle for a number of different regulations that originally it wasn't intended for. It was there to ensure building safety. But over time, not only our building code, but building codes elsewhere in the country and elsewhere in the continent have started to do more than one thing. It's not just about standards and safety. It's also about climate and energy efficiency and other things. And what we like about it here as municipal policy, as municipal leaders, is that it's a very clear authority that's been given to us by the province. We don't have our own building code like Vancouver does. Vancouver's in a totally different realm because they have the Vancouver building bylaw, which is essentially their own code, but we don't have our own code. And so without our own building code, we don't have the ability to regulate emissions in buildings. We don't have the ability to regulate efficiency in buildings. Mm-hmm. And so it's always very welcome for us when senior levels of government give us these enabling authorities so that we don't get ourselves into trouble by pushing the envelope and ending up in the Supreme Court, which is what happened when we banned single-use plastic bags in this city. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with pushing the envelope, but it's a lot cleaner and safer and better when we can just say, we have the authority to do this.
And it's already sort of been greenlit in a way. It's just you've decided to accelerate it because you can.
We opted in, yeah.
Yeah. And so is there something about like is there something unique about Victoria that makes it easier to do it here, or is this something that any other municipality could really be replicating? Or I mean, obviously every region, every jurisdiction has their own challenges.
The legislation certainly available to all municipalities, and it's really a question of political will. I mean, I guess the question municipal voters need to ask is, did we elect people who are willing to move forward on climate action? And in Victoria, we did. We had a number of candidates who ran on being climate champions.
Yeah.
We had a lot of community support for that, and a majority were elected. So we're lucky.
Yeah, and not
to
just in
have one
Victoria
another.
either. Not just in Victoria
Yeah.
either. I think there were 142 declared climate champions elected in last year's municipal elections in BC. So,
Yep.
you know, I mean, there's a lot of municipalities, but that's still quite a, you know, it's a significant number of people who have been elected on that promise. And this is it sounds like this is maybe some low-hanging fruit.
Well, I'm going to give a very different answer to that question.
Okay.
As someone who's been working for the last few years as a provincial policymaker and was trained in that role to take a province-wide approach, Victoria is somewhat different in that we are, first of all, connected to the main integrated grid, which means we have a very low grid. We have low grid emissions. Our emissions factor is quite low because we're connected to the main grid. Not every part of BC is connected to the main grid. So part of the northeastern part of the province around Fort Nelson is connected to the Alberta grid. They are sort of an extension energy-wise of Alberta, and therefore they have much higher grid emissions. So electrification is not synonymous with decarbonization in Fort Nelson as it is in Victoria. Likewise, places like Haida Gwaii run almost completely on diesel generators. I mean, they have diesel generated electricity up there. So just because you're electrifying your building doesn't mean you've gotten off of fossil fuels. Whereas in big portions of the province, especially in the temperate parts of the province down here, where we don't have usually the extremes of cold and hot that other parts of the province have, it is somewhat easier here. Having said that, that's really more of a consideration around energy efficiency than it is around decarbonization of systems. There's no reason you can't run a heat pump in pretty much any part of the province, but it is easier when you're not dealing with the extremes of hot and cold. So I don't really know.
The electric heat pumps, the electric heat pumps will sort of bottom out at after a certain temperature.
Yeah, that's right. And so I don't know how you decarbonize build. Aside from having solar PV on a building in Haida Gwaii, I don't really know how you decarbonize a building in Haida Gwaii right now. Just because you're connected to the grid, you are essentially running a fossil fuel system. And that's not the case in Victoria.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one other thing too, though, that's interesting about the zero carbon step code, which is that it's fuel neutral. So it doesn't actually say anything about gas or oil or anything like that, or propane. It speaks in the language of greenhouse gas intensity. And so much of the regulation is a very complex set of charts that show what your maximum allowed greenhouse gas intensity is per year per square meter of built floor space. And there's 4 levels of ambition. And so what we did in Victoria is we went all the way to the highest level of ambition, which was level 4.
Right.
And what that means in effect is that you cannot run your building on natural gas, let alone oil, because the greenhouse gas emissions that come from those fossil fuels would exceed the maximum allowed under the regulation.
Right. Yeah.
So it's the long, complicated technical way of ensuring electrification of buildings. And that makes total sense if you're on the main integrated grid. So I'm in Victoria, so I only need to worry about Victoria now. But back when I was a provincial policymaker, we lost sleep over the fact that there are chunks of this province. Not only are there chunks of this province that are not on the main integrated grid, but there's quite a few rural indigenous communities that are still running on diesel generators, like on Haida Gwaii. So those are maybe somewhat exceptions to the rule, but at a certain point, we have to deal with the fact that not every community in BC has access to low carbon electricity.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. But I guess, so one of the other questions that I wanted to ask was, what are the costs of implementing this? Like, because, you know, obviously there's going to be some cost to the taxpayers of Victoria. Is it significant? Is it something that's going to have a payback over a certain amount of time? And I think the question that everybody's going to want to know is, you know, everyone keeps talking about this housing affordability crisis that we have. How is this going to be, you know, yet another cost add-on to that impacts the affordability of new homes?
I'm just taking my own thoughts on this. I don't think it's going to be a significant impact to the cost of housing, and especially if we take the long view. When it comes to the cost of housing in Victoria, at least, it is so unaffordable right now to get a single detached house. Most people in Victoria don't even try for that. We're 80% multifamily / attached housing, but the cost of decarbonizing is actually fairly low compared to the cost of a new home. Like, it would add a few percent to the cost. But as Jeremy was suggesting earlier, it can reduce the cost of operating the system in the long term. So the cost of heating a home is lower. It also gives you, if you're using a heat pump system, an electric heat pump system, it gives you cooling in the summer. And in Victoria, as across BC, we had deaths at the last heat dome. We had 18 people die from the last heat dome. And if we had heat pumps in all residences, I know that's a long time from now when we'll have that set up, but we need to move towards that. We can prevent some of the worst impacts of climate change. Yeah, so the savings for electrifying your heating system and using heat pumps will pay for the cost of the additional cost of installing the heat pump at the outset. And so really it's a question of when the costs occur. Do they occur all up front, or can some of them occur later? Now, the province has the ability to create financing mechanisms that will help people to pay for heat pumps over the course of the lifetime of the heat pump. So we can get that initial cost covered. But as I say, it's only a few percentage points on the cost of a new home. New homes are rightly regarded as luxury. And so generally we look at it, and our analysis is it's going to increase it a little bit, but it's not going to, you know, double the cost of housing or anything like that. And what we're doing on this council is taking steps to make housing a lot more affordable than it otherwise would be in this city. And we've got a lot of other mechanisms that we're using to move forward on the affordability aspect, rather than by cheaping out and having carbon emissions as our affordability strategy.
Right. Okay. So you're looking at it in a holistic manner. In terms of overall, we're doing what we can to improve affordability, but you know, this is just, we're not going to shortchange ourselves in the long term.
I would answer it similarly and just say it's not expected to have major impacts on new construction. And that's the other thing, is that this regulation that we've implemented, it's important that everyone listening to this understands that it pertains only to new construction.
Right.
And so it's the cost of building in, let's say, heat pumps instead of natural gas is pretty negligible to the average build, whether it's a single family home up to 6-8 story multi-unit residential building. Where it does start to get a little bit trickier is high rises. So I've had a chance to consult a bit with the building community. There have been fully electrified towers built around here, but it's still somewhat unusual. It requires a larger on-site storage facility where your heat pumps, for instance, might be stored. There's some different design considerations. In some instances, BC Hydro has to do a big service upgrade to a block to handle the new service load. And we've had a lot of touch points with BC Hydro about that, because they need to adapt to this rapid electrification. But the incremental capital costs are pretty negligible. And from the research I've done and the understanding I have is that the incremental capital costs from doing the energy step code, the building efficiency stuff, is actually more considerable. But even that is 1 or 2% of incremental capital costs, because you have to think about all the insulation in your HVAC and all your systems. Whereas decarbonization is often a little bit more straightforward. So our expectation is that there's not going to be big costs passed on to consumers. And in fact, a lot of builders, frankly, are already building electrified buildings around here. This regulation that we've implemented, for the most part, just brings the baseline up and deals with all of the laggards, if you will.
Jeremy mentioned BC Hydro, and I just wanted to add a little point there. Often you'll hear people wondering whether BC Hydro has the capacity to supply electricity for the electrification of buildings and transportation. And we did have BC Hydro come into City Council and speak to us about this. And they were very clear that we're actually in an electricity surplus BC-wide up until 2030. After that, the combination of conservation work and efficiency work that BC Hydro is doing and distributed renewable generation, so things like wind and solar, are going to be more than enough to cover our overall energy supply needs for electricity in the future. As Jeremy said, the investments from BC Hydro that are needed are going to be the little local ones, like putting a transformer in on this block, etc.
It's not the quantity of electricity, it's just getting the amount into that particular block. Like the electricity is available, it's just, it has to get there.
Exactly, and we put BC Hydro on notice that we are aggressively electrifying buildings and transportation in Victoria. We're very serious about moving it forward faster, and this would be a great place to focus their investments for electrification.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that, you know what, that's a good lead in to, you know, I also wanted to ask about some of the obstacles that you faced in, you know, in forwarding this initiative and bringing it forward. And you know, obviously the, you know, consultation with BC Hydro up front, you know, that obviously made a big difference. Were there any other sources of pushback, or were there, you know, were there any other obstacles that you faced in bringing this forward? Or so where did that come from, and how did you get past it?
I think that there was the normal, as Jeremy mentioned, we were already on a pretty expedited time frame Victoria was on an expedited time frame to get this done, you know, 5 years ahead of the provincial requirement. And so there was a perception among some that we had already kind of sped it up, and do we really need to? And, you know, the region is kind of working among municipalities to try to bring this through at the same coordinated timeline. So it was a bit of a discussion a few times to make people sort of, I guess, aware and comfortable with the idea that we could actually do it quicker. We had a really great number of conversations with our staff, highly professional people who in the end made the recommendations about what these timelines could be. And then we saw some movement from other municipalities, some discussion starting to happen, and we were really thrilled when the District of Saanich decided to adopt our expedited timeline, just showing that, you know, that sort of bigger picture goal of one municipality helping another municipality along, being an example, can actually work. And I think
sort of paving the way and proving that it's possible. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. I think it was April 25th or maybe April 24th that Saanich announced they were going to adopt our new timeline. Jeremy, is that right?
Yeah, they adopted our exact timeline, and I've been in talks with two other jurisdictions around here that I won't mention because it hasn't gone public, who are contemplating the exact same timeline. So our timeline was developed in consultation with our staff. We basically said, if we were to do this, what is the fastest we could do this in a way that is bold but not brash? And this is what they came back to. And then we implemented that. It's important to note that we own that decision, not our staff, but we did consult with our staff. So it's very cool and heartening to see other jurisdictions following our lead, because I think it demonstrates that Victoria is a leader, and also that this timeline is desired by elected officials and by jurisdictions around our region. We're not some isolated, we're not the black sheep of the family. We're demonstrating leadership and showing that it's okay. We're enabling bold action elsewhere. And I think that's beneficial in and of itself.
Exactly. Well, it's imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So
That's
that
right.
you're onto something positive when other people are copying you.
And it looks like Burnaby was about a week ago when they accelerated their timing as well. So hopefully that's going to catch on throughout the Lower Mainland.
That'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
So I want to turn our attention to some of the community engagement aspects of this initiative. Were there any other climate action or construction building, building construction trades groups that you engaged with on this project to get input, or even just to make sure that they were on board?
Yes, a lot of that happened before we were on council, but our staff tell us that there was about 2 years of consultation that took place with the building community, I think between 2020 and 2022 or thereabouts. And I believe it was an extension of the consultations that have gone on through the BC Energy Step Code Council, which is a big working group between the province, the feds, and a bunch of different stakeholders, jurisdictions, building organizations. So there's just been these parallel consultations going on at civic and provincial levels, to the point where I don't think anyone in the building community was blindsided by this. We haven't had any pushback at all. I think it's actually been a lot simpler than dealing with energy efficiency, which, as I've noted, I think is just actually a much more complex beast. And one of the things that Councillor Thompson and I did when we got elected is we sat down with our staff and said, is there a practical or practicable way to expedite the energy step code, so the energy efficiency stuff? And they said, honestly, no. We have this established timeline. It would have a whole number of knock-on effects, but they were more open to the idea of us going fast on the zero carbon step code.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I just add to that, in addition to those consultations that the city staff ran for a couple of years, environmental groups in the area were starting to get interested in this, especially the workaround model that I discussed earlier. Even before the election, there were groups talking about, well, maybe we should just use that workaround and try to move things up a little quicker. As it turned out, the zero carbon step code came through, and Councillor Cardonna and I were talking about, okay, well, if it doesn't get adopted in time, we will just go ahead and bring a motion under the workaround mechanism. But we didn't have to, because BC did announce the zero carbon step code. But certainly having that input from community groups and that support for that kind of climate action was good, kind of raised the level of attention among other council members. And I know that they were going out and talking to councillors from other communities as well. So laying a bit of the groundwork for the idea of accelerating, regardless of what the actual policy mechanism is, was a good initiative. So
maybe we can start wrapping this up and think about. But what we really want to do is, I'm really interested in, if you think about our, the mandate of WECAN in supporting our member organizations, and not all of our member organizations necessarily have the luxury of being in a city like Victoria, where this has been, that consultation has been ongoing for a couple of years already. In terms of, like, if you're in a community where you really want to get things started as a local group, or get in front of your local councillors to start making this initiative happen, What kind of advice would you have to that, or to, you know, some of our climate champions who have been elected to council and are wondering what steps they should take to get this process started so that they can accelerate this?
That's a good question. I would say there's two things. First is look to your staff. The larger jurisdictions have building science experts, they have sustainability experts on staff who can answer a lot of these questions. And for the smaller jurisdictions, there is an abundance of support from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and also from the Building Safety and Standards branch, which is now part of the Ministry of Housing. And so there's a lot of provincial civil servants who can guide people through this process. I think definitely if you're looking at decarbonization of the built environment, which is essential. I mean, here in Victoria, it's what, slightly more than half of all of our emissions.
Yeah.
At this point, it's obviously at the municipal level, it is the thing to tackle aside from transportation and waste, but buildings is really number one. My advice to others would be to start with new construction, because you've now been handed enabling authorities with the energy step code and the zero carbon step code. Start with those and then do as we're doing in Victoria, which is move on to the much harder, high hanging fruit, if you will, which is existing buildings. So going back to your question, well, I don't know if you've actually asked this question, but I'll answer the question, which is what authorities do we have to regulate the emissions of existing buildings? The short answer there is that we're still testing those limits. We're still trying to figure out what our authorities are. But going back to your earlier question of why expedite things, it's because we have the clear authority to regulate new buildings. Whereas if we allow buildings to be built using high carbon systems, they enter into this regulatory gray zone where it's a little bit unclear how much authority we do have to regulate them. And also going back to your question about cost, I mean, the reality is that eventually we need to pull all of the fossil fuels out of all the buildings.
Right.
As my friend Matt says, we need to start treating fossil fuels like asbestos and get them the hell out of our built environment.
And the more we put in now, the more, you know,
the more asbestos we're pulling out later.
Right. Yeah.
Or burying behind drywall. In any case, the costs there are going to be huge, and Victoria will not be able to fund all of that. We're going to need big help from senior levels of government for those long-term processes of decarbonizing existing buildings.
Yeah. But so this is, you know, this is a great first step to, you know,
yes.
to set us on the road for that. And,
yes.
and there's and you're right. There are a lot of tools that need to be brought forward, from financing and, you know, building codes and trades and everything, like across the board, to manage the whole. It's a dog's breakfast of, you know, of everything. We're related to retrofits of all different buildings of shapes and sizes, right? So
yes, what I would like to do in Victoria, just giving a peek into my cards for a minute, is for us to eventually set a date by which there just are no more fossil fuels in buildings in Victoria. And that will not happen until the 2030s. So if that's 2032 or 2035, it doesn't really matter to me, but at a certain point we need to say, okay, we need to start a decade-long process of decarbonizing our current buildings. Because if you look at the pie chart of emissions from new versus existing buildings, new buildings going back, let's say the last year or two, the lion's share obviously is existing buildings. We have tens of thousands of existing buildings. We're not building tens of thousands of buildings every year. So we can't ignore the fact that the much more challenging approach is going to be getting fossil fuels out of existing buildings. We have set a date. We updated our carbon leadership plan recently as well. And as part of that suite of directives to our staff, we moved up the phase out date for oil tanks to 2027 from 2030 in Victoria. So we have a date for oil tanks. We don't have a date for natural gas. And meanwhile, more and more natural gas lines are actually being hooked up all the time.
Right.
So we're actually
so that when it comes
growing in
time
opposite
to
directions.
when it comes time to, you know, remove those gas hookups, the longer you delay, the more work you're going to have.
Yeah, and a lot of it boils down to this unicorn known as renewable natural gas that everyone is waiting to fly in over the horizon. I mean, this is what we're told by Fortis, is that eventually the natural gas pipeline is going to be populated by low carbon products. But right now it's, I think,
Right.
0.01% of the mix. And it's completely unclear where these tens of millions of liters of renewable natural gas are supposed to come from.
As my understanding with renewable natural gas at this stage, at least, is that it's really only, like, we should really only be thinking about that for sectors that are very difficult to decarbonize.
Yeah,
and
I
not as
would
a
agree with that.
mainstream, you know, hey, we can decarbonize with RNG and just keep going status quo with all of our gas hookups.
and building heating is not hard to decarbonize. So yeah, this is not the use case for it.
It's not
But
the
I
use
mean,
case for RNG, right? Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Also, RNG or renewable gas, it depends on your definition of it. And I know Fortis has played with the definition a bit, and it includes syngas, which can be derived from fossil fuels. So we're kind of going back to fossil fuels. So it could be regarded as a bit of a shell game. But I mean, just to get back to the question of what can a councillor do, or what can community members do to make things happen quicker on the new buildings, I think it comes down to three things. As Councillor Cardonna said, it can be done. You have the legal authority. Number one. Number two, it's not overwhelming because other municipalities have already done it. Several of them, and others are working on it right now.
Well, and you said, what was the bylaw was like a page and a half.
Yeah, it's not overwhelming. And then third, look at that bylaw. Look at our bylaws. Look at Saanich bylaws, and borrow from them. You know, this is something that's pretty doable. You need to have the conversations that you need to have in order to build the political support, whether that's on council or support coming from outside of council. You need to have those conversations with industry. You don't need to do what they tell you to do. What you need to do ultimately is get the votes organized.
And we get told all the time, stay in your lane as city councillors. And I think it's important for other civic leaders across the province to understand this is your lane.
100%.
Right.
The province made this our lane. So
right.
You can swim in it.
Yeah. So there's nothing stopping you, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, Jeremy, there was another topic you wanted to mention as well, and I think that provides more of a broader context to these conversations. Did you want to introduce that?
Yeah, I thought it might be nice to mention that we did a pretty significant update to our climate leadership plan, or at least we gave direction to our staff to begin working on that. We haven't gotten the report back on what it'll mean, but I can give a little bit of detail about what we directed our staff to do, because
give us some teasers. Yeah,
I mean, our climate leadership plan goes back to 2018. For a few years, it was I would say continent leading, or right up there. And then I think it slipped a bit during the pandemic. And also, as I noted, in council, it's such a fast evolving space that it's actually pretty easy to fall behind on climate action these days. So what Councillor Thompson and I came up with, and which council endorsed, and I think it passed unanimously, was that we begin to take a look at our natural assets in Victoria and see how we can leverage them for enhanced climate emergency planning. And there's been some incredible natural asset work that has been done across BC and across Canada to figure out, what do you have in terms of natural assets, whether it's a foreshore or an urban canopy or urban wetlands. What are your natural features in your city that can be enhanced, protected, leveraged in terms not only of mitigation, but really in terms of adaptation? So we're a bit behind on that.
Yeah.
Then
and
probably
so, I just wanted to
please.
touch on that, because that natural asset management is something there is a framework for that, and I don't think most people realize that. And what it does is it allows you as a local government to bring those natural assets into the discipline of asset management, which is something that's, you know, one of the core functions of a local government, right?
Exactly. We need to
and
start
so it
managing our
provides you with
natural
some
assets.
with some numbers around, hey, by protecting this urban forest, by, you know, by protecting this foreshore, or by enhancing these natural assets that we have, there's actually, like, it affects the city's bottom line, because, you know, because you're replacing, you know, if you remove that forest, well, it provides some tangible services
Yep.
that would have to be replaced by engineered assets, right?
Very, very well said. And Gibson's BC is really the shining example in BC, where they essentially recognize that by preserving and enhancing their urban wetland, they could avoid building X number of millions of dollars worth of waterworks and culverts.
Brilliant.
So we're moving in that direction. Probably the blockbuster decision was for us to start tracking and setting reduction targets for consumption-based emissions or life cycle emissions. This is a whole can of worms, but essentially the way that emissions are tracked right now is based on the emissions that are emitted in your jurisdiction. But if you want to think about the emissions that were emitted, making all the products and services that are consumed in your jurisdiction, those are consumption-based emissions or life cycle emissions. And many jurisdictions now are starting to dip their toes in that regulatory water and see what they can be doing to ensure that we are reducing life cycle emissions. So it's not just about what's combusted in Victoria.
Right. Yeah.
Vancouver is a leader in this space, and they've started really in the sector of the built environment. So they actually have targets and regulations as part of their building code to reduce the embodied carbon of new construction by, I want to say 40% by 2030. So we have some catch up to do there. Then we also moved up the phase out date for oil tanks, as I noted. We directed our staff to quantify the past and projected economic impacts of climate change in Victoria. We want to know how much it's actually costing us. And we directed them also to create an annual declining carbon budget, which some of the more progressive jurisdictions around the world have done. We don't want our emissions reductions to be abstract targets. We want to have annual reductions, and we want to think about emissions in the same way that we think about our financial budget, which is that we have a set amount of carbon that we are allowed to spend. And every year that needs to go down by 5 to 7% on average in order for us to hit our targets. And if they don't, then certain mechanisms need to kick in so that we are reducing our carbon emissions year over year.
To me, that's the biggest one here, is the annual carbon budget, and the consequences if we don't achieve it. What we've seen over the last probably 25, 30 years in climate policy is governments setting fairly distant targets, 10, 20, 30 years out, and delaying action, and then finding out, hey, funnily enough, we didn't meet that target. And so now we're going to have to set a new target. Whereas the idea behind a carbon budget is because we're basically drawing a line and we want the emissions to go down every year, we're going to know right away if we're not making it.
Right.
And we're going to need to have those mechanisms that lead to an automatic, frankly, tightening of our belts on carbon. Right away. So we don't have
it's
that
just
back end.
If you can't measure it, right? If you can't measure it, then it makes it much harder to manage, right? So if you've got a way of if you have a way of tracking how you're doing, then you can still decide not to do it if you're not meeting your targets, but at least it's visible. It provides that transparency.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's a decision as opposed to something we just neglect. And
exactly.
so we do get the data every couple of years.
Right?
Exactly. And getting that data, and it comes out every 2 years, allows us to be intentional about where we're going. I mean, in some ways, it makes our lives more politically difficult, Councillor Cardonna and myself and the rest of council. But frankly, I think we need that. I think we need to be challenged to be acting on climate change and not taking the pressure off, because getting back to the impacts of climate change, we don't have time to goof around anymore.
This is true.
Our society has been goofing around for 30 years on this, and we've known about it for more like 50 or 60 years. So now's the time to act.
Exactly, and by funneling it into a carbon budget is really a purposeful move, because we still live in a world in which the dollar is almighty. And so the budget, what we want to eventually do is elevate the carbon budget up to the level of the financial budget, where there's report outs on it annually, where we think about it and speak about it in ways that are not dissimilar to the financial budget. How much carbon can we spend that year? Are we in a carbon deficit? Do we have an excess? Maybe there's a year in which you have an excess that's where you pour it into your whatever infrastructure needs to be built that would actually expend more, emit more carbon than an average year. We need to evolve our thinking around these things and see it as important as a financial budget.
Of course, yeah, and because there's more than one currency that dictates quality of life, right?
Yeah.
And you see that, you know, with triple bottom line analysis, with benefit corporation, with benefit companies and things like that, where they're not I mean, you still have to manage your finances, but that's not the only thing that you're beholden to, right? So that's great that you're bringing that initiative forward. So
yeah, and there's actually a couple more things I haven't even mentioned, which is that we also committed to a fully circular economy by 2050, which had not been done before, and to adapt our waste reduction measures around that new target, because waste is I think, what is it, 6% of our emissions, Dave?
Right.
But it's still pretty significant. And that's actually, if anyone listens to this recording who is in another jurisdiction and is maybe a civic leader out there, it is important to know that waste is one of the exceptions to the territorial emissions rule in BC. That is to say, the only thing that really counts is what is combusted in our city limits.
Mm-hmm.
The exceptions to that are the grid emissions. So we do take some possession of the emissions that come from our grid, but the big exception to that is waste. So any waste that is generated in the city of Victoria, garbage, that is hauled to Heartland landfill, which is outside of the city limits of Victoria, and then generates carbon dioxide and methane, we own those emissions. That's an exception to the territorial rule, because in theory, the city of Saanich, the district of Saanich, should own those emissions, even though because the garbage is emitting emissions in Saanich, but we actually own those emissions.
Well, so because we produced it.
Exactly, but that's an exception. That's not the case. For instance, if you live in Victoria and you drive a car, if you drive that car outside of Victoria, in theory, those emissions would be owned by the jurisdiction that you're driving in theory, right? They're not owned by the home territory.
That would seem to be a little bit more difficult to monitor.
Oh yeah, it's very difficult to
putting
monitor.
GPS trackers on everybody's cars.
We're in the weeds here, but the point being is that you civic leader need to take responsibility for your waste, even if the emissions are emitted outside of your jurisdiction.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the things that we're doing, not to take it too far down this rabbit hole, but over at the Capital Regional District, where Director Cardonna and I sit on the board, we just approved a ban on wood waste entering landfills and other forms of construction and demolition waste that don't need to be there, that will break down in the landfill and cause methane emissions. And we also asked staff to explore the impacts of doubling the tipping fees and doubling the fines for illegal dumping. So there are ways that you can tackle, and this wood waste and construction demolition waste is about half of the waste that goes into our landfill, close to half. So we do need to tackle, even though it's a small percentage compared to transportation and buildings, we do need to tackle that too.
You can't ignore it.
You can't ignore it, and it's forward on all fronts.
Yep. Fantastic. I'm hearing transparency, and I'm hearing accountability. And these are words that we're not accustomed to hearing from our elected officials. So it's been extremely refreshing talking to the both of you, and learning about this initiative, and extremely reassuring that this is something that I think a lot of jurisdictions are realizing that they can easily implement, and because basically it's all laid out for you, and it just requires the political will to make it happen. obviously some conversations would need to happen if you're starting from scratch, and your public engagement. But these are very solvable problems, and the urgency is certainly there.
And I would just add to that and say that we need to flip on our heads our understanding of who needs to take responsibility for climate change. Yes, it's the responsibility of all levels of government, but I think something like 60% of all emissions in Canada come from urban areas. I might be a little bit off on that, but a very large percentage does. And we are small. We don't have big bureaucracies. We're nimble. We can get things passed very quickly. From the time of thinking about this to passing this motion for Dave and I took a couple of months. We're not dealing with these massive bureaucratic barriers. And so I think that civic leaders need to step up and take responsibility. We cannot wait for provincial and federal governments to solve this. We need to take responsibility for the emissions that are in our jurisdictions and even start to think about the life cycle emissions that are generated by our jurisdictions. Do it now. Do not sit back and wait. And if some higher power gives you the authority to do it, take the opportunity to do it.
Exactly. We can do it. We need voters to hold our feet to the fire and hold us accountable. And we need you to work to increase our level of ambition.
Yeah, well, we will be.
We'll hold you to that
for sure. Yeah, no, we will be holding our leaders to account. That's what you're supposed to do in a democracy, and that's how it's supposed to work, right? So
yep.
So, yeah, the only criticism I've gotten from any climate champions, it relates to the urban canopy, because we're constantly dealing with the fact that anytime we densify this city, almost inevitably leads to a few trees being cut down in Victoria. And this is such a contentious issue. And it's a difficult one for me, I think for Councillor Thompson too, because we obviously are completely committed to our urban canopy. And in fact, our urban canopy is expanding. We have more and more trees every year in Victoria, although a lot of people think we have fewer. We actually have more. But the unfortunate corollary of densifying our city is that sometimes we need to cut down a tree or two. Yeah. But some people take this as like an assault on climate action and some kind of an indication that we're not committed to natural asset management, to reducing our emissions, et cetera. So that's a difficult one for me. I get sometimes very pointed emails from people saying, how dare you call yourself a climate champion when 2 trees had to be cut down for that development? And I still haven't really figured out exactly how to respond to those kind of people.
I've showed them pictures of what happens when you don't allow housing in cities, which is that it gets built in what used to be forests and are now clear cuts.
Yeah.
The impact of not having 40 housing units stacked on top of one another is that you have 40 units spread out through what used to be a forest or what used to be a farm.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like I need to forward some emails to you then, Dave. You can take these ones on.
And you know, and you're right. Sometimes a tree has to be removed, and sometimes you can find opportunities to rejig a development so that you can save, so that you can save a character tree or a heritage tree of some kind.
We do that all the time too. And Eric, what you said is to my mind reasonable. I think 95% of people would accept that, but 5% of people would not accept what you just said. And so that's a tough one, because I don't want to speak for Dave, but I mean, we think of ourselves as highly committed, motivated climate champions, but there's still always a small percentage who think that we're frauds.
Yes.
And we're not doing enough, or we're hypocritical, or we haven't put our money where our mouth is. So that always keeps me hungry, keeps me motivated. That's for sure.
If you don't have critics, you're not doing anything.
That's true.
I suppose that's true.
We also need to point out to them the direction that council moved, which is to increase the amount of parks and green space, especially in underserved areas of the city. We've got a lot of parts of the city that are very lush and heavily treed, and we've got a few areas, the older downtown central areas, where ironically we've got more people and more people moving in all the time. Those are the areas where we really need trees. And so we've asked staff to work on accelerating the provision of trees and green space in those areas.
Right. I appreciate your time today, gentlemen, and really appreciate your candor and your transparency and helping us inform our members and listeners about this initiative, and hoping that others can emulate the example that you've been setting. So
Thanks, Eric.
well
Really
done,
appreciate it.
and we hope to hear more from you in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this, and looking forward to hearing from others too.
Fantastic.